class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing 5 reasons why the Sharks were eliminated in the Stanley Cup playoffs, the 5 reasons why they aren't facing off against the Boston Bruins on Monday. And before I get into this, I do have to mention the fact that it is well known that out of the big 4 sports in North America, football, basketball, baseball, and hockey, hockey is probably the one game with the most variance. It's one of the reasons many people say that, that cliche, any given team can win on any given night. That obviously comes from the fact that there is some good parity in the NHL, but also from the fact that there's so much variance in a single game of hockey. Sometimes one team will have pucks deflect off their sticks and go into the net. The other team will have pucks deflect off their sticks and go out of play. And so on any given night, any given team can win. And you see that more maybe internationally in world championships and Olympic play, where games and series are usually just one game. So the semifinals will be a single game to advance to the finals, where you'll have teams that are maybe incredibly stacked going up against teams that are maybe less so stacked, and yet the games are close, if not even a victory for the underdog, just because sometimes, as I said, a puck goes 1 inch to the left instead of 1 inch to the right, and you end up missing wide instead of getting a perfect top shelf shot. And so there is some variance, and I'm sure there are some people who believe the Sharks got unlucky in terms of bounces, but I won't mention that in this video as one of the 5 reasons why, as I'm sure some St. Louis fans or Avalanche fans will be able to point out the fact that maybe they got unlucky in their respective series. And so it is something that you'd like to be able to fight through, and they do give you a 7-game series in the NHL to try and prove that even with variance in specific games, that you can be overall the much more consistent team. And so the first reason why, play-wise, the Sharks were eliminated in the Stanley Cup playoffs would be their lack of a killer instinct in these playoffs. 6 times in these playoffs did they have a 1-game series lead, 1-0 up on the Golden Knights, 1-0, 2-1, and 3-2 up on the Avalanche, and then 1-0 and 2-1 up on the St. Louis Blues. And then all 6 times they managed to lose the next game. Obviously, against the Golden Knights, they ended up losing the next 3 and fell behind 3-1, so you could maybe exclude that. But against the Avalanche, every single time they had the 1-game series lead, the Avalanche were allowed to tie it up, which is the main reason why this series went 7 games. If the Sharks managed to actually, win another game in a row to get a 2-game series lead, that series could be over within maybe even 5 games, which would allow them to get some much-needed rest for players like Burns and Karlsson. But instead, every single time the Sharks had a series lead, they've sort of just sat down and said, the series is basically over. We don't have to try the next game. And then eventually it would get tied up and they'd have to come back out. So the Sharks did make it far enough just based on the fact that when they were tied or trailing in a series, they had a very good record. But the fact that they were 0-6 when they were leading in a series was very disappointing, especially when you look at the St. Louis Blues series. They had chances in that series to take a big series lead. They were up 1-0 and 2-1. This series could have very well been 3-1 going into Game 5. The Sharks would have been in a much better position than tied at 2 going into Game 5. But instead, once the Blues got a series lead, they were up 3-2 after Game 5. They managed to close it out, something the Sharks have not managed to do the entirety of the playoffs, by making it 4-2 in Game 6. The second reason why the Sharks were eliminated was because the Sharks' depth. As I said, it was okay in the series against the Golden Knights, but it was not good enough in the series against the Avalanche and the Blues. You take a look at the third line for the Sharks, besides Game 1 against the Avalanche and then I guess Game 3 against the Blues, it really wasn't all that apparent. Sometimes LeBanc would chip in with a goal here or there, but Sorensen I don't believe had a goal in the entirety of the playoffs. Thornton wasn't nearly good enough in nearly enough games. As I said, a couple of games here or there Thornton really showed up in, but it wasn't enough, so the third line wasn't that apparent. Obviously, the fourth line, Barclay Goodrow, had huge games in Games 5 and 7 against the Golden Knights, but other than that, there wasn't much coming from the fourth line. And then on the second line, if you can consider that to be, I guess, Pavelski, Kane, and Hurdle. Hurdle obviously had a few games here or there, multiple games actually within the first couple of rounds, but he really fell off in the series against the St. Louis Blues. Evander Kane never really was on in any series, and Joe Pavelski, after returning from injury, he had that great Game 7, but throughout the entire series against the Blues, he also wasn't that apparent. And so it was basically just the first line for the Sharks that managed to stay consistent at least over the first 15 to 17 games of this series before not having the best last 3 games against the Blues. But for a team that was really praised for their depth coming into the playoffs, people thought the reason they would succeed would be their depth and the reason they'd fail would be their goaltending. That was almost the opposite in these playoffs, where the goaltending was actually really good and brought them far in the playoffs, but the depth was failing them time and time again. The next reason would be the fact that the Sharks' power play was mostly ineffective. Of course, it is weird to say that the Sharks' power play was the reason they were eliminated, as technically the Sharks' power play was the only reason they actually made it to the third round, because in Game 7, it's unlikely that they would have managed to tie that game without the 5-minute major and 4 power play goals during that time. But if you exclude that, which of course is hard to do, but even if you exclude that, they only had 8 power play goals in the other 19 games in that series, in those playoffs. And if you take out the Vegas series, they only had 4 power play goals over the last 13 games of the playoffs, including one of them being a 5-on-3. So that is less than 1 power play goal every 3 games. And against the Avalanche, it ended up being okay just because the Avalanche power play was just as ineffective as the Sharks power play. So scoring 2 goals over just 7 games ended up being okay enough, even if that series could have been over much sooner if the Sharks power play was actually clicking. But against the Blues, when the Blues actually managed to get their power play rolling, even if there were a couple of lucky bounces on that, it really burned the Sharks. Just taking a look at Game 4, a 2-1 Blues win, the game winner in that game was a power play goal. Or taking a look at Game 6, the game winner in that game also was a power play goal, and the insurance goal that made it 3-1 was another power play goal. And so the Blues managed to get their power play rolling, even if it took some good bounces. The Sharks couldn't get anything doing. It seemed to be solved back in the Avalanche series, and the Blues basically just perfected what the Avalanche were doing and made it even worse. And so the Sharks couldn't get anything rolling. And it's obviously tough to make adjustments on the fly in the playoffs. There aren't many times to practice. And at the end of the regular season, there weren't really many red flags, considering they finished 6th in the regular season in terms of playoff percentage. But it was disappointing to see that there wasn't many adaptations done to the Sharks power play that was rather predictable by the end of the Blues series. Next thing would be the fact that the Sharks had to roll with 5 defensemen. Of course, Radim Shemek was injured in the last few weeks of the NHL regular season, and he would not play, or mostly wouldn't play for the rest of the playoffs. There was like a chance he could come back for the Stanley Cup Finals, but that was extremely unlikely. And so Joakim Ryan would have to step in as the 6th defenseman, which if I told you that 6-7 months ago, you'd probably say, oh, Joakim Ryan, he was very good last season. What's the problem with that? Well, he didn't just take a step back this year. He basically fell down the entire staircase back to step 1 for Joakim Ryan. He was disastrous mostly, and Peter DeBoer gave him some good chances at the end of the regular season to prove that he is a trustworthy player going into the playoffs. He had multiple games down the stretch with Erik Karlsson and Radim Shemek injured to play with Brent Burns and show that he was capable of being trusted, but he never showed that. So much so, actually, that Peter DeBoer decided to insert Jacob Middleton in the second to last game of the season to see if maybe Middleton was a better option than Ryan, which if a rookie who's only played one other game in the season and in his entire NHL career had the possibility of replacing you going into the playoffs as the 6th defenseman, then you know there's something going wrong. And so into the playoffs, DeBoer had zero trust in Ryan, and rightfully so. He only got a few minutes a game if he was lucky. Sometimes he could get like 4 minutes in a single game, playing maybe 3-4 shifts in the first and like a shift in the second period, and that caused the fact that the Sharks defensemen were getting overplayed. Obviously, Burns had the most ice time in the league by basically a mile, as he was playing a ton, and you could tell that was taking an effect on him late in the Blues series. Same with Erik Karlsson, who you would have hoped to get a bit less ice time just due to the injury that he had, but with the fact that Ryan was untrustworthy, you gave Erik Karlsson the extra minutes, and that could be a reason why that injury was re-aggravated late in the Blues series. Vlasic, I was impressed with. He did step into that role playing the extra ice time and actually looked pretty good, but it's not a recipe for success. Yes, you can bring up the fact that the Blackhawks back in 2015 ran with basically 4 defensemen, but that's mostly the exception and not the rule. Normally you want to try and be able to roll your 3 defensive pairings, and because of Joakim Ryan's untrustworthiness and Radim Shemek's injury, that wasn't really the case for the Sharks during these playoffs. And that brings me to the fifth and final point, which of course is something that wasn't really in the Sharks' control. That is injuries. So the Sharks during the first half of the regular season had some good luck with injuries. There really wasn't anything of note. But in the second half, it started to pile up a bit. There was the injury to Vlasic that lasted a good month, a small one to Braun here, and some other small ones here or there. But the major one, of course, was Erik Karlsson, as he was injured for the majority of the latter half of the season. And then, of course, Vadim Shemek, with a few games left in the season, also got injured. So going into the playoffs, all of a sudden you have Erik Karlsson, who played, I guess it was 19 games, as he missed the last one, all with an injury. Who knows how severe it was at times, but obviously he was not 100% healthy. There were injuries to players like Vlasic for a couple of games, Donskoy for a couple of games, Pavelski missed 6, and the last game of the Blues series. Hertl missed the last game of the Blues series. Shemek, of course, was not playing the entirety of the playoffs, and so the Sharks were probably one of the more banged up teams. And you take a look, as I've said multiple times, you take a look at the Blues, you take a look at the Bruins, and there really aren't many injuries to speak of. Besides, I guess the Blues have Vince Dunn on the sideline, so there were factors in game for the Sharks that they could have fixed. As I said, the depth, the power play, the fact that they had to overplay their top 5 defensemen, which sort of relates to injuries, but whatever. But injuries were something that were hard to avoid for the San Jose Sharks, and so there was a lot against them in the playoffs as a whole, just because of the fact that they got a bit unlucky at the wrong time of the year. I'm sure any Sharks fan would take injuries back in November and October, like some teams sustained, compared to getting injuries in April and May, like the Sharks sustained. But that will do it. As I said, it's not entirely these 5 reasons. There are tons and tons and tons of factors in hockey games and what could go wrong. As I said, sometimes some things were rolling, some things were not. And very rarely can you have teams that are rolling on every single factor, teams that are so good at depth and top line and power play and penalty kill and the neutral zone and every single thing. But when it comes down to it, you come down to the last 2 teams, the Stanley Cup finalists, and it basically comes down to which team is rolling on as many cylinders as possible. And with the Sharks struggling with depth, struggling with the power play, struggling with their third defensive pairing, it's not a wonder necessarily why the Sharks were eliminated in the Western Conference Finals. Class dismissed.